Okay, so aside from the tapes, one of the big things was, and this I believe also is one of the rituals that comes down from the Hare Krishnas, is when the leader eats food or touches stuff, it's purified just by his presence. And it usually what this was he would eat food and then they would take the leftovers off his plate and send it out to his followers around the world. And they called that Mahaprasad. So we would get sent bits of food that we would then eat and that would purify us. But a friend of mine took it just a little step further. She sent me a letter one day. I'm just going to nickname the cult leader SP. So she wrote to me and she said, on Sunday, we had a choice chant. I got so much Maha. I was standing with another person. I think it was her brother. And we were standing right next to him. He got heaps as well. So that would be the food scraps. I will send you some of my Maha. I also followed SP and went after him, getting the sand in his footprints. I have a Maha bottle full of it. I ate about 2 teaspoons of it. It tastes cool. So she ate sand out of his footprints because it was considered purified. And I did hear rumors, I don't know if it's true, allegedly people were also eating his toenail clippings.
Oh, man.
I don't know if that's true. I never saw that part. Definitely the food scraps were something that I experienced. This and my friend, I actually saw the bottle of sand. She showed it to me. So it was, that was definitely real. But for the other one was kind of a rumor that I heard about.
So she ate sand.
She ate sand,
and it tasted. She said something positive about how it tasted. Cool. Cool, huh?
Yeah,
cool. Huh. At what point did you realize this wasn't something you wanted to participate in anymore? Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Generation Cult. I'm Deanna Levy, and you just heard from a woman named Lalita who called in for this episode all the way from Australia. She is a fan of the podcast who reached out to me a while back regarding a religious organization that she grew up in known as the Science of Identity Foundation, which formed in the 1970s. It incorporates into its practices what it calls the science of yoga as a way to understand one's identity, and it has similarities to the International Society of Krishna Consciousness, or the Hare Krishna movement. So Lalita will be telling us about her own experience with this group in today's episode, which also marks the last episode of the season. That's right, Generation Cult is wrapping things up for a bit, although we have hopes to come back for a season 2, so we will most likely be back in the new year with new episodes. If you've listened to other episodes, thanks for sticking with us. If this is your first episode that you've heard, welcome. I hope you enjoy it. Now let's get to our interview. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for talking to me all the way from Australia. I've been really looking forward to talking to you about your group because before you reached out to me, I didn't know anything about it. I had never heard about it. And before we really get started, I would love it if you could give us some more details about the Science of Identity Foundation.
Sure. Originally, most of the members were Hare Krishnas. They all met in a temple in New Zealand in the late, sort of in the 60s and 70s, but they split off from the Hare Krishnas in the late 70s and then set up a commune, I guess, in Australia in the 80s. And then things just grew from there.
Is their ideology similar to the Hare Krishnas?
It has aspects of it, but it was kind of this mishmash of Hinduism, Christianity, and Buddhism thrown in there as well. But it was mostly, I think, just the guy who ran it. It was his philosophy, like what he'd cobbled together, what he thought was how the world worked.
Okay. And he started out in the Hare Krishna movement, is that right? And then kind of developed his group out of that?
No, I have found articles from the mid-60s from Hawaii, where he was based originally, sort of indicating that he might have started his own group before he joined the Hare Krishnas. And then he took all of his followers to join the Hare Krishnas. And then allegedly, from what I've read online, he had some fights, and there was maybe a slight banishing to New Zealand. And then that's when he sort of met people and started the group.
And the group is still active right now, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And is it mostly based in the US?
It's actually spread out all over the place. There's a big following in Australia and New Zealand. There's a fairly sizable following in the Philippines. There's a big following in the US. I think maybe all up there could be around 1,000 members, but I've been out for so long now, I'm not really sure where those numbers are at today.
So I guess let's start with your family. How did your parents get involved with this group?
Well, my parents were in an ashram in New Zealand. They met there, and then the guy who ended up running the Science of Identity Foundation came to New Zealand, and then that's where they met him. The details of what happened next is kind of a little bit foggy, but from what I gather, there was either a falling out and the guy who runs the cult left, and then they followed him to Australia. Otherwise, the other story that I was told was that the leader of the Hare Krishnas passed away. There was a big fight amongst all of his lead followers over who was going to be the next successor. No one could agree. And then he started his own group. So it's either one of those two stories. And so basically once he left, my parents followed him, and they've been following him ever since.
So they're still in?
They're still in, yeah. My whole family, and including some extended family as well.
Okay. What do you remember about it? Did you grow up on a commune?
We were kind of one of those interesting groups that kind of interacted with society for a bit, but not so much. Like, we were living in normal suburbs, but we didn't really interact with the people around us. My earliest memories were going to it must have been a kindergarten that they ran themselves. I just remember being there, going to classes when I was very little on different subjects, and just doing prayers as a group and getting into a lot of trouble. And then we did have a brief period where we were allowed to go to school, public school, which I think for me was between year 2 here and year 5. So I think I was 6 up until age 11. And then we were sort of living on a farm in the northern part or sort of the mid-coast of Eastern Australia. And we were sort of in society, but not in society. So we were there, but we were separate. And I hope that sort of makes sense.
It does. Yeah. So what did you think as a kid? Did you like it? Were you happy?
Well, I guess initially, yeah, because that was all I knew. It was, it was fun hanging out with my friends, and you have this whole, like a secret society mentality almost in a way. I guess it is really, where you get to hang out with your friends and you've got this great big secret that you get to keep and you're special. And it was kind of that camaraderie of you have this interaction that no one else outside of it knows or understands, and you're sort of brought up with this idea. So yeah, initially it was good until it sort of hit my teens and I started to realize that I was quite depressed, and all the things that they were telling me to do to not feel depressed was making me feel more depressed. And it got to a point where I just felt like I was this happiness that I was supposed to have, that they were telling me that I would get from doing all the things that I was doing, wasn't happening, and I didn't understand why, and it was a very confusing time. So, and a lot of the things that we were being asked to do, the way people were being treated, it just all started to fall apart for me because it just felt unfair a lot of the time, the way people were treated.
Tell me more about how people were treated, both adults and children.
Well, there was difficult to sort of describe because a lot of it is trying to work out how much of it is just normal people interactions and how much of it is very specific to the group that I grew up in. But there was a lot of running around being afraid of doing the wrong thing, like saying the wrong thing. Quite often we'd get communications from the US where the leader would go back to saying that he'd gotten sick because of someone had fed him the wrong food, or something had happened and it had made him sick. So everyone was in trouble. And we, even as children, were responsible for paying penance for the fact that he wasn't well or something bad had happened. Or, I remember writing in my diary, he got sick one day and apparently caught a cold so bad he dislocated his jaw from vomiting or something. And we were required to do like 24-hour prayers, which meant we would stay up and take shifts to pray for the cult leader. So that there was a lot of, I just remember there being a lot of fear and just people walking around in a lot of secrecy. And yeah, you couldn't talk openly. You couldn't interact without worrying that you were saying the wrong thing to someone. So it was always this constant state of watching yourself, watching what you say. And it just was exhausting.
You mentioned earlier that you got in trouble a lot. What sort of things did you get in trouble for?
I remember being like very young, I think maybe about 4 or 5. And one of the religious things that we had to do was this prayer where you stand there with a stick of incense and you have pictures of the various succession of leaders of the group. And you had to circle each body part with the incense 3 times, which became very boring as a 5-year-old. And I remember doing that and looking at the incense, and my mum used to smoke when I was very little. So I looked at the incense and I thought, oh, this looks a bit like a cigarette. I wonder what'll happen if I smoke it. And then the teacher saw me do it, grabbed me, smacked me really hard and threw me out the house that we were in. And then all of the kids just refused to speak to me for weeks. Really horrific thing of pretending that something that looked like a cigarette was a cigarette. So yeah, that sort of, I'd get into trouble because I was a curious person and I just wanted to try stuff as you do as a kid. And that got me into a lot of trouble.
So it sounds like the shaming came from the other kids. It wasn't just adults or the leaders. It would be kind of everyone around you would react to some sort of misdoing.
Yeah, well, it's that self-enforcement that happens in these groups. Like you're taught to judge each other right from the word go. You're taught to keep each other in line. And so that's what they were just doing, what they were taught. So that's what we did. We all did it. Unfortunately, it never sat well with me personally because I just didn't understand why I had to judge someone I considered a friend so harshly. But that's just the way that it was growing up.
How many people were involved in this? Like, about how many people did you have around you in your community at one time?
We had, I would say, a couple of hundred at various times, but we were spread out all along the coast of Australia, or the east coast of Australia. So there'd be a big group in, say, Sydney. There'd be another big group in Queensland where they originally set up the operations. And we'd all, like once or twice a year, we'd go to Queensland and have a big religious camp out, I guess. We would all meet up, do prayers and have feasts and all those sort of religious things that probably happen in most religions to some degree. But yeah, we'd sort of have our own little groups and then we'd all have a big gathering every now and then.
And you had your own schools. I think you mentioned, I remember when we talked before, you said something about a boarding school in the Philippines.
Yeah, education was kind of a complicated history for me. So initially they started off having schools. I don't know why they were within Australia. I don't know what happened there. Probably something to do with the legal requirements within Australia for kids to be in education. I don't think there was any leeway to running a homeschool. And then they let us go to public school for a while. And then the leader of the group decided he didn't like us being influenced by the teachers there. So we were all then pulled out of school again. And then they started their own schools in the Philippines, a boys' school and a girls' school that the kids were then sent off to, I think from as young as 12 to this boarding school in the Philippines.
And boys and girls were separated. I remember you said something about that. Now, was that something in the boarding school or was that throughout the group?
That was throughout the group. So from the age of about 10, I think, we weren't allowed to interact with kids of the opposite sex, our own age. So we were kept separate. We weren't allowed to talk to each other at all. If we ever wanted to interact with each other, we had to get permission from our parents. So it made dating or seeing other people incredibly awkward and difficult.
I bet. Yeah, it must be impossible to pursue any sort of relationship.
I had no relationships with anyone until I left. So it was really not the most pleasant thing. So essentially, like, the way that it was set up was that we weren't allowed to interact. We had separate accommodations. Even with the religious ceremonies, we had to stay separate, like stand in separate parts of the room. We weren't allowed to socialize with each other. So yeah, we had to get permission to even like show interest in each other. There was a lot of arranged marriages as a result, and a lot of marriage breakdowns because you didn't have that sort of normal interaction where you got to know someone, got to see if you actually like them, and then take it from there. It was just like, hey, you had to show interest in this person, work up the courage to tell your parents, and then maybe they might agree to letting you go and have a supervised visit with them. So yeah, it was a bit awkward.
That sounds really protective, but at the same time, it also sounded like there were ways children were treated inappropriately, like in a sexual way. I saw something about the leader discussing sex acts with people from a very young age. Is that something that happened?
Yeah. So for us, because he was based in the US, he would send us, and I think it's changed now, the method, but not what happens. He would send us lectures of him talking on tape, and then we would have those tapes played to us. So we'd have like get up very early in the morning. We'd do morning prayers. We'd do what we called chanting, which is probably similar to the Hare Krishnas, where we'd chant, sing prayers for an hour or so, and then we'd sit down and they'd play this tape. And quite often these tapes were of the leader talking about his philosophy. He'd then go on about how much he hated gay people, how much he hated these people and that people. And then quite often he'd go into quite graphic descriptions of what gay people were doing, what he thought was horrible, like how uncontrollable people were around sex or having sex, and just go into a lot of detail. I remember being quite young and I just feeling very confused about a lot of things. I know that of my own research, I've looked into the fact that kids will quite often explore sexuality from a young age, but for us it was just filled with so much shame. I remember acting out a few things with my cousin and then just feeling like, oh my God, we need to go and die because we've discovered that we have emotions and it's this really terrible, horrible thing to have. Like, how dare we even think about sex as human beings?
Wow. And what was going on in your mind during all of this? This must have caused stress for you and your friends and your family.
Yeah, it's impacted. It still impacts me, the whole just interacting with other people, especially people who are of the opposite sex. I find it quite hard. Even though it's been 20 years and I've had lots of interactions with people, I still don't really, I can't quite have a normal interaction with people because it's almost like my baseline understanding of relationships has been completely skewed. So I don't know if I can't tell if someone's talking to me because they genuinely just want to get to know me. And it just becomes very confusing even now. I know for a long time, especially when I first got out, I couldn't actually be physically intimate with someone without drinking a lot of alcohol first, because it was just such a traumatic thing to do, because I was going against everything I've been raised to believe in. And there was just a lot of self-punishment, I guess, over just wanting to just be intimate with someone.
You also said that the children worked a lot. I mean, it sounds like everyone did, the adults and the children.
Yeah, that's a big one. It was kind of hard to explain, but if I could sort of summarize it, our whole existence was there to serve the leader of this group. He was our spiritual master. And so any moment of our lives that wasn't in service of him was wasted. So anything that we did that was outside of it was a waste of our time. It was taking us away from going back to heaven or Godhead, which is what we called it. And if we weren't investing every second of every day, every thought into serving him, then we were doing him and ourselves a disservice. So it was kind of expected from an early age that we would go and work for him, whether that was doing things like transcribing his lecture tapes, working in his office. He had a kitchen where he had food made for him. If you were lucky enough to be invited over to work for him, then you got to go and work there. But the conditions were just really, really long. And I actually have a letter, which I mentioned to you, which kind of helps outline just the kind of hours that us kids were subjected to.
Yes, let's hear it.
So this is from a friend of mine. She was working. Okay, so just to give some background, she worked quite closely with the cult leaders' stepchildren. And she would do everything for them. That they obviously got special privilege being the stepchildren of the cult leader. So they would have all their food made for them, all of their laundry done for them. They'd have their own personal masseuses, physical trainers because they were training to do movies. So this letter from my friend, she was one of the people that was doing most of that work. So she says here, just got back from late night cleanup. It's 3 a.m. and I have to finish this letter because I will try to get them posted tomorrow. In the kitchen, I'm just going to skip over names because I don't really want to call out people by name. She gives a couple of names and myself all work under another person who is an inhumane slave driver or worse. My hours are 1 p.m. to 7 p.m. and then 10:45 p.m. to 3:30 a.m. And in between those times, I sleep and I don't have much of a social life. She was 18 when she wrote that. And I know other kids that had been working for him doing those sorts of hours from the age of 14, 15. And they weren't paid. They were just doing it because that's what was expected of them. I know other people who at that sort of really impressionable age doing those sorts of hours and then making a mistake and then being fired, his version of firing, kicking them off whatever duties they were and made to just wander around a neighborhood in the middle of the night trying to find somewhere to sleep. Like that's the kind of punishments that they had.
That's terrible.
Yeah.
What did people get out of following this guy? I mean, he sounds awful. Your parents had to have gotten something out of this.
I don't know. I mean, I find it very difficult to find anything pleasant about the guy, but the only thing that I have been able to gather from them is it just gives them a sense of purpose. It gives them, they're almost in a way more afraid of what will happen if they don't stay than because he's filled them up with these ideas that the world is a terrible place and they're all going to hell if they don't follow him. And if they just stick with him, he's going to lead them to enlightenment. So I think that they're more fearful of what will happen if they don't stay than they are of what if they do stay.
Yeah. Yeah, because that's what seems to happen. I mean, nobody, as far as I know, says, hey, I'm going to join this really restrictive cult and have this guy order me around, and it's going to be great. I mean, people join for some reason that benefits them in some way, and then it just, I guess, turns bad. It gets more and more demanding. So I assume that's what happened with your group, but that sounds really intense with all the work and with the demands of this guy. I think you mentioned that he was also a germaphobe. So that, yeah. So that probably caused some issues, and he probably had problems with a lot of things that people did.
Yeah, he actually had quite a few of the kids serving on what they call air patrol, which was if he was intending to go somewhere to, say, give a lecture or something, they would have to go to this location and sniff for toxins because they had to make sure that it was clean for him to go to. And then whenever he was in a location, they were stationed outside of this location sniffing for toxins. And if they smelled something, they'd run and tell them so that they could evacuate him. I love about it now because it's just so, but it was this, I remember it being this very intense, very important role that we had to protect him from all the germs. And that was actually kind of one of the key things that made me leave was I was like, I would go to these lectures and he'd be saying, oh, well, I'm the emissary of God and I'm the closest person to God. And we have such a great relationship that I have this special understanding with him that I can leave this plane of existence whenever I choose. And he was terrified of germs. And I'm like, well, that doesn't add up because you're terrified the bugs are going to do what? If you can choose your death. So what does it matter if you smell something in the air?
And another letter that you mentioned to me said something about drinking out of footprints of his.
Yeah.
Please tell me more about that.
Okay. So aside from the tapes, one of the big things was, and this I believe also is one of the rituals that comes down from the Hare Krishnas, is when the leader eats food or touches stuff, it's purified just by his presence. And what this was he would eat food and then they would take the leftovers off his plate and send it out to his followers around the world. And they called that Mahaprasad. So we would get sent bits of food that we would then eat and that would purify us. But a friend of mine took it just a little step further. She sent me a letter one day. I'm just going to nickname the cult leader SP. That's just sort of one of the nicknames we called him. It's just easier. And when I see his name, it's easier to read it out. So she wrote to me and she said, on Sunday, we had a choice chant. Okay. So chanting was just a religious gathering with SP. I got so much maha. I was standing with another person. I think it was her brother. And we were standing right next to him. He got heaps as well. So that would be the food scraps. I will send you some of my maha. I also followed SP and went after him, getting the sand in his footprints. I have a maha bottle full of it. I ate about 2 teaspoons of it. It tastes cool. So she ate sand out of his footprints because it was considered purified. And I did hear rumors, I don't know if it's true, allegedly people were also eating his toenail clippings.
Oh man.
Yeah. I don't know if that's true. I never saw that part. Definitely the food scraps were something that I experienced. This and my friend, I actually saw the bottle of sand. She showed it to me. So it was, yeah, that was definitely real. But for the other one was kind of a rumor that I heard about.
So she ate sand.
She ate sand.
And it tasted, she said something positive about how it tasted. Cool. Cool. Huh.
Yeah. Cool.
Huh. At what point did you realize this wasn't something you wanted to participate in anymore?
It was really a long process for me. So one of the big things in the group was that they wanted to do a movie. SP was writing it and we were all going to be in it. It was this big thing sort of in the early 90s. And so he ended up coming back to Australia to film this movie that he was writing. And we were all very excited about it because he was in the country. So we got to actually spend time with him and we got to be in a movie, and who doesn't want to be in a movie when you're a teenager? So I ended up going because we lived about 1,000 kilometers away roughly from where he was going to be based. My aunt and uncle had gone up ahead and moved to where he was living, and I went to stay with them for a while so that I could be part of the inner circle and work my way in. And while I was there, I just started to, I guess, really see things for what they were. I was only maybe between 15 and 17, I think, at the time. But I'd already had questions about, because there was a lot of secrecy within the group. We weren't allowed to tell anyone what we believed in. We had to hide it. We weren't allowed to show people in public what we believed. So the Hare Krishnas would go out and get donations or do live sort of chanting. We weren't allowed to do any of that. We weren't allowed to let anyone know what we believed. And so I already had questions about, well, why can't we tell people? And then so I went up to we called it being on site with this person. So I went up to be on site with SP, and while I was there, it was just a lot of my friends, like 14-year-olds, being fired because they were working in his office and they stood around for too long. They were in this constant state of distress because they'd been fired and thinking, oh my God, am I going to be expelled from the group? Is he ever going to forgive me? And like the 14-year-olds. And then they had to write him these groveling letters of apology to say, please let me back in. Please let me back to work for you. And I just remember getting really angry at it. Like, it just didn't seem fair. And then one day I actually had the opportunity to talk to him face to face. My cousin and I were walking around a park with my uncle, and he was in the park. All of a sudden it was like, oh, great. And then he invited us to walk around with him and talk to him. And it was a very big privilege. We were beyond excited. And so we started walking around this park with him, and he was asking us, oh, so what do you want to do? What are your aspirations in life? And my dad was a musician. I'm a passionate musician myself. And I was telling him, oh, I really want to learn how to play piano. I really want to write music. I'm very excited about it. And he said, oh, hold up your hands. So I held up my hands. And it's probably going to sound petty, but it really just, I don't know. I held up my hands and he looked at them and he goes, oh, you'll never be able to play pianos. Your hands are too stumpy. That's
who
okay.
says that? Like, who says that?
I know. No. And that was my reaction to it. It was like, what? Like, you're supposed to be this great spiritual leader who's enlightened, and you're being so petty. He just was like, oh, but I have the same problem. My hands are stumpy too. Held his up, and it's like, but it's okay. We'll have the same problem together, kind of thing. And it's like, no, I really want to play piano. Don't tell me I can't do that.
Well, did you go on? Did you go on to play piano?
No, well, sort of. Those things, they leave a mark, and it left a mark. But I walked away from that experience, and I just thought, I don't know that I'm that impressed with him. And and then I went to a lecture not long after that, and he was talking about why he started his first cult, I think, or got involved in religion, and he was talking about how he was dating a girl and she broke up with him to date a guy who was richer, and he was so angry that she dared date somebody else that he ran off basically and joined the circus or joined a religion. And that was his whole reasoning. And I'd grown up with being told, because I was female, and in this group, females were considered subhuman, like literally told, you are a lower form of birth. You will never achieve the same spirituality as a man. So therefore, your place is in the kitchen. You must serve your husband after you serve your spiritual master.
That makes me angry.
Yeah, me too. So he was telling me all of this and then telling me why. And I'm like, so you got dumped by a girl and you joined a religion and you're punishing me because of one person, because you had one bad relationship. And I remember being so angry at the time. And I just wanted to stand up and walk out, but I couldn't, because I knew to do that meant being rejected by the entire group, kicked out. I wouldn't have a home. I was 16. Like, what am I going to do? I don't know anyone in the outside world at that point. So that kind of was at the start of the whole unraveling for me. It ended up being a catalyst moment when I'd already sort of started to pull myself away. I'd stopped chanting. I'd stopped doing all the prayers, and I was fighting a lot with my parents over it. I ended up in a really severe car accident and almost died. And I just remember the moment before, because the car that I was in hit a tree roof first, and I was in the car, and I remember seeing the tree in the headlights and just thinking, I'm not ready to be done with this life yet. And I came out of that, and I just realized after that, like within a month, I needed to get away. And that was the catalyst for me. It was like, I'm not living a life that I want to live anymore, so I need to get away. And so it was quite a long process after that of making contacts in the outside world, which is really difficult to do when you've sort of been cloistered in a group for so long. I was lucky that the internet was just starting to be a thing. Chat was just starting to be a thing. So I could chat to people online without my parents being able to say too much, because they didn't know who I was talking to. And I was able to make some contacts outside of the group, and eventually just made a small group of friends. There was a guy that I'd been chatting to who was looking for a flatmate. I moved out of home with him. I'd known him for about a month.
And how old were you?
19. So it took a while.
And did you tell your parents you were leaving, or did you just sneak out one day?
I did tell them I was leaving. They actually ended up driving the moving truck, but it was under duress on their part. They didn't want me to go. They literally just threw my stuff in a garage and drove off. They were that angry with me. But they couldn't. At that point, we'd had so many fights, and I'd just said, I'm leaving. I'm not staying in this. I don't believe in it anymore. My mum had already told me I needed to go because I didn't believe what she believed. So that was it. They were, I think, in a way, kind of happy to get rid of me because I was such a troublemaker.
And did you go to another city, or were you still in the same town as the group?
No, I moved to a major city that wasn't that far away from where my parents lived, like about an hour and a half drive. I still saw them from time to time, but I just didn't interact with the group. So I'd have friends write letters, which I just basically ignored, not because I didn't want to talk to them, but I knew if I got into any sort of dialogue with them, they'd be trying to pull me back in. And I didn't feel like I was at a point where I'd be strong enough to say, no, I don't want this.
At that point, what was your education level like?
I hadn't had an education since I was taken out of school at the age of 11. So I'd started to try to do some we have distance learning in Australia where you can get your, I guess it's the US equivalent of junior high. So I'd started doing some distance learning to give myself and I had to really fight for it because my parents didn't want me to do any sort of education. And I just said, look, at some point I'm going to have to get a job. At some point I'm going to have to do something to earn an income. I can't just rely on a husband. And at this point I'd never had a relationship. So they're like, yeah, probably true. They let me sign up for a distance education course that was the equivalent of like a junior high qualification. But because I had no support, I think at the time 17, I ended up just taking a long time to do that. And I didn't end up getting that qualification finished until I was 21. So when I left home, I had the equivalent of a 5th grade education, which made it difficult because there was a lot I didn't know or understand about how the outside world worked, particularly around like things like tax. I didn't know how that worked. I had to have people show me how to do any of that. I know to some degree people have to learn that anyway, but it's just like this extra added level of, well, I don't even know half of what anyone is talking about. And it was really hard to hide from people. I felt like I always had to hide my lack of education from people. I felt really stupid for a really long time. I ended up going to do some university preparations courses when I was in my late 20s and finally got that high school level education that I always wanted. But it was almost traumatic in a way, going back to school, like being in a classroom. I hadn't been in a classroom since I was 11. So at 27, it was a terrifying prospect. I remember having nightmares for weeks before I even walked into the classroom. But I actually really enjoyed it. It was an amazing experience. And I don't think I've ever stopped doing classes since then. It's like, yes, learning is amazing.
What direction did you take with your education?
Yeah, I ended up doing quite a few courses in audio engineering, ended up with a audio engineering diploma, and then finally went on to get a postgraduate diploma in acoustics. And I now work as an acoustic engineer, which is amazing.
That's great.
My dad owned a recording studio, or a project studio, which is a smaller recording studio, and I'd grown up in it. But because being a girl, my dad didn't really want to invest any time in me, so I had to fight a lot to get into a studio, and he didn't really want to teach me anything. I learned how to use studio equipment. Quite often it was just like, right, fine, you've annoyed me enough. There's the studio, off you go, enjoy yourself. Here's how you turn it on. But I really wanted to learn more about how it all worked. How did the technology work? Why does this happen? Why, I'm a why person. So I had so many questions that I wasn't getting answered. So I wanted to go and study audio and learn all about the technology so I could use it. And so that's what I did. And then while I was studying audio, I started learning about the physics of sound, and that was just amazing to me. And just this whole world opened up. So I went and studied the physics of sound, which is acoustics. And that was just probably one of the greatest experiences of my life.
Great. What was it like other than the education aspect? You mentioned when you moved out, you moved in with somebody who you'd only known about a month. How did that go?
Fine, I guess fine, but I just remember I don't even know how to quite put any of this into words, but I remember feeling like an actor most of the time. When I first moved out, it was like this sort of weird feeling of I was putting on an act for everyone because I was just copying everyone around me. I didn't know how to interact on a social level. I didn't know how to make friends. All my friends had been people I knew since I was born. So I didn't know how to interact with other people in a way that was considered normal. So I just copied everyone around me. And I always felt like a bit of a fraud, I guess, because I was just pretending. But it was, at the same time, it was also really exciting because I was allowed to just do whatever I wanted. I was free to just be someone. And so I had this really sort of amazing time of, I guess, exploration, learning how to be a person. And then things sort of started to go a bit downhill. I think I've heard a few other people on your podcast talk about ending up in abusive relationships, and that's what happened to me as well. And I ended up with someone for 10 years who was quite emotionally abusive. And I think that I just went back to what I knew, because it did get quite scary for a while being out in a world I didn't really understand yet. And I started to realize that in a way I mattered. I think that was a kind of a turning point for me in my recovery. I started to realize I actually mattered to people. I mattered to myself. What I wanted mattered. And so I almost had another awakening, and I realized that the relationship wasn't working to me. That's when I got myself into therapy. And I just realized that through therapy, how much of what I was doing was just me interacting with the world in a state of shock almost. I wasn't really feeling anything. I was just playing a part. And so I had to actually learn how to be vulnerable with people, how to be open, how to be myself, which was a terrifying prospect because that was the one thing I wasn't allowed to be growing up.
You said you did a lot of pretending. Did you pretend in the sense that you made things up about yourself, or did you just try on different personalities?
Yeah, I did, but it's difficult because I didn't like lying. So I'd pretend by not talking about a lot of things. If people asked me questions, like direct questions about things that I knew I wasn't, like, oh, what school did you go to? It'd be like, oh, yeah, somewhere up here. And I think at one stage I pretended I did go to high school because I'd seen enough television at that point. I think I could just sort of make it up as I went along. But yeah, it was a lot of pretending that my life was okay. Growing up, it was normal. I didn't tell anyone what I'd grown up with. I don't think I could even really articulate it at that point anyway. But it was pretending also in the sense of taking my social cues from other people, copying what they were doing, not necessarily following what my instincts would be because I knew my instincts weren't great, only because they were the instincts that I was taught growing up. That's what I mean by pretending. I pretended that I was a normal person.
Yeah, no, I relate to that. Sometimes I feel like the personality that I have is just a mishmash of other people's personalities who I liked, who I met over the years. So what are you up to now? What are your relationships like now? Your work life? How are you doing?
I think good. I mean, I always feel like it's all still a work in progress. I'm still processing. I mean, I've only just clicked over the point where I've been out of the cult longer than I've been in. And I feel like now I'm starting to feel a bit more okay with my life, okay with me being allowed to want things for myself. That guilt that I sometimes get with doing things for myself isn't as strong. It still happens. If I'm vulnerable with other people, I really struggle with it for a couple of days afterwards. I get panic attacks if I am too open with people. That used to floor me for a couple of days. Now it's like, oh, yeah, I don't feel good about this, but it's not affecting my life as much as it did. I'm in a new relationship. Well, not new. We've been together for 10 years now, but with a really great guy who's really supportive and really understanding and kind. And he's very different to anything I've known. And that's been an incredibly healing experience. I have children. That's also been a healing experience, but also I guess, a bit of an eye-opening experience, because I look back on the stuff that I grew up with and I look at my kids who are now sort of that same age, and I just think, oh my God, I can't believe that that's what we were subjected to at that age, because I couldn't do that to my kids. Yeah, it's kind of like it's healing, but it also brings up a lot of other questions and a lot of other memories and feelings about things. So it's always a work in progress, and I think it always will be.
Your parents, are they in your life at all?
No. So part of this whole sort of being okay with myself, I went through a point where I just was tired of lying to everyone around me about what I grew up with, because that's what, in a way, even though I had been out of it for a long time, that's kind of what was still required of me. That was like the last task that I was doing for the group, was keeping it a secret. And I reached a point where I didn't want to keep their secret anymore, because it wasn't helping me. It was hurting me in a lot of ways. And I couldn't have my family were keeping secrets from me. And it just became this whole thing where I just thought, I can't do this anymore. So I put a big, I guess it's almost like a coming out statement on Facebook, just saying, here's what I grew up with. Here's the name of the cult leader. This is the name of the group that I grew up with. Here's what happened to me. And I did it because I knew my parents would see it. It wasn't like a globally privacy set thing. It was only to my family and friends. And I just said, I've had enough. I just can't keep the secret anymore. And as soon as I did that, my brother and sister immediately blocked me on Facebook. My parents, they kept me on Facebook for a little bit longer than that, but they just were like, we're not talking to you. And then eventually everyone who is still in the group stopped talking to me.
Do you ever hear from anybody who leaves and needs any help?
I did for a while, but the biggest issue that I found, particularly with our group, is because of the amount of paranoia and secrecy that exists within the group, people coming out of it are equally paranoid because that's what they've grown up with. And it's done so much damage to their emotional state that it's almost like it becomes this whole other paranoid group. And I found it quite difficult emotionally to be immersed in that. So I started drawing back from speaking to people because I just found myself being pulled back into the same sort of mindset. And I found myself automatically going into this very deeply paranoid mindset that I don't like being in, because I'm not a naturally paranoid person. I'm just a curious person. I want to know about stuff. And then so having to like keep secrets and, oh, this person's Facebook page has been hacked, because there was a lot of paranoia that the group were tracking us and trying to shut us down. They have done that in the past. There have been websites that have spoken up about the group and they've been sued and for defamation and shut down. I know there was a politician who started voicing concerns about the group in New Zealand, and his career was destroyed through litigation.
Oh, I hate that type of thing.
So
I hate that type of thing, using the legal system to silence people. Ugh. Sorry, go on.
No, they get away with it because there are no protections for people like me. So even speaking to you now, it's opening myself up to litigation, which is why I've tried to keep it to just talking about what I know. But it's hard because it's like, how do you speak up about these things when on a whole there are no protections for you?
So basically you go from being in this group where you're paranoid about, I guess, the outside world, and then you come out and then you're paranoid about the group. It's kind of like you're never free.
No, I found that coming out, like I tend to be quite a scientific person in my approach to life. So I went through a lot of phases of, I called it the great unlearning, where I had to examine everything that I did in my life and say, well, am I doing this because I want to do it or because I've been taught to do it? It started with like not saying certain prayers at certain times, not doing sort of certain superstitious things like, I don't know how to explain that because there's a lot and it's too much to go into now, but just little superstitious things that were done in the group, not doing those, just putting a stop to that. Another big one, because we were brought up to not eat meat, was eating meat, just to see if that was something I wanted or if it was something that I didn't want. But just going through this process of pulling apart all of the little threads that sort of made this fabric of my background And it's amazing how much of that you take with you. And that's what I saw with a lot of the other people who'd come out. They hadn't been able to, or they were still in that process of pulling all of that apart. And you just take it with you. I mean, it's your framework for life. How else are you supposed to view life? So, of course, they're deeply paranoid. Of course, they're going to be worried that all of that stuff that we were taught to fear growing up isn't exactly what's, you're going to take that with you because that is your makeup.
Yeah, that's why it's so damaging. You start out from an early age having this stuff fed to you and you don't have any other context. So what else are you going to do?
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else you wanted to talk about?
I don't know. I guess maybe I just kind of have a message for people who are finding themselves with questions in these groups, because maybe they might find their way to your podcast and maybe they might hear some of these stories and it might help them think a bit more about what they are growing up in and those doubts that they have. And I just want to say that trust your doubts. Like, if you feel like something isn't right, then it's not right. It's a big thing with these groups that they make you feel like asking those questions is shameful. It's something you shouldn't be doing, but it's absolutely the right thing that you should be doing. Always ask questions. Never stop asking questions. And always feel that it's okay, because I know personally you're going to be okay if you leave. The world's not this horrific place that they tell you that it's going to be. It's just not. There's a lot of good people out there. There's a lot of help out there now, and you're going to be okay if you want to leave. You should be able to leave. I mean, that's your basic human right, is the right to be able to choose for yourself what you want in your life. So I just wanted to pass that on to people who might have some doubts. It's okay.
Thank you. I agree with that statement. And thank you for speaking out yourself about this. It's so important for people to share their stories and talk about their experiences. And I think it probably will inspire other people to leave whatever situation they're in. It doesn't have to be a cult. It could be a controlling relationship or something else they don't like that they're involved in. But hearing people like you talk about this, I would see as inspiring to someone else who might want to make a change in their life. So thank you.
No problem. I hope it helps someone.
So that's the show for today. And also that's a wrap for Generation Cult's first season. Thank you so much to everyone who helped make this happen. And again, we're hoping to come back in the new year with a season 2. Big thanks to our guests who shared their stories. Please keep in touch. We're at generationcult.com. We're also on Facebook and Twitter. You can email us at generationcult@gmail.com. Catch up on previous episodes. And if you like the show, leave us a review. Thank you to the band The Chaw for providing music to the show. You're listening to one of their songs right now. And if you want to hear more of their music, look them up on iTunes. They're really good. Thanks again, and we will hopefully see you next year.